Generative AI is here. It's already here. There is an urgency. We need to embrace rather than resist. The conversation that I have with my teams a lot around selection and assessment and the inclusion of AI is we need to stay true to our first principles. Right. So thinking about fairness, reliability and validity, because in a sense, those are the guardrails that can protect against unintended bias in the kind of war for talent, if we like to call it that. It's really important that we remain at the leading edge and we're incorporating new methodology as quickly as we possibly can. I actually am behind your campaign to scrap the CV.
There is just an argument that the CV has had its time. We do need to think about the process. There is an alternative to the CV. It needs to be a bit more behavioural based. Mm-hmm. GenAI actually now indicates that it needs to be a bit more interactive. And then we have this challenge. Do we encourage candidates to use GenAI in the process? And we talked about, we've got to embrace it. You know, the cat's out the bag on this one. Everybody's using it like a calculator.
I think it is true to say, as practitioners in the field, where we want to hold ourselves up to the gold standards, we need the research to be shared and publish free access research so that we can together move forward and innovate. So I think in order to prepare for that and keep pace, your research is a good starting point, because I think that there are some great takeaways there in terms of how recruiters can be really thinking about embracing rather than deterring.
Yes.
Can be thinking about more holistic, task-based methodology as opposed to reliance on some of the traditional methodologies.
Welcome to the Arctic Shores TA Disruptors podcast. And today I'm very excited to be welcoming Sonia Pawson, who I've known for over 5 years now, and is one of the most respected talent acquisition leaders in the country. And I'll explain now why, of the many things that you've done in the past, starting off, I believe, in the helping selection and assessment within the prison service, and then for the last few years running what is arguably, I think, the most prestigious and premium graduate programme in the country, the Civil Service Fast Stream programme. I know you look after more than 250 staff, covering not just the selection and assessment and onboarding of 1,000 grad roles, but the entire L&D offer across many sectors of government as well. So somebody with a lot of experience in talent acquisition, but also I know that you're a chartered fellow of the Institute of Personnel and Development, and also, which I'm especially excited about for the discussion that we'll have today, a chartered occupational psychologist from the British Psychological Society. So a lot of practical experience, a lot of knowledge as well from both a sort of academic but also very much a practitioner perspective on identifying what makes people successful in different types of roles. And I think the final bit, just to add on this introduction on this, is that I know that you are especially passionate about best practice in assessment and maintaining the highest ethical standards. So with that introduction and that sort of mix of many things that you'll bring to the conversation today, welcome to the podcast, Sonia. And I'm looking forward to talking with you. But perhaps you could just give some of the listeners a bit more about what you do in your current role.
Thanks, Robert. I'm delighted to be here as well to talk about selection and assessment and the advancements in AI. So I have had, as you've outlined, 20 years or so, I can't believe that now, we're looking back, practical experience in terms of developing selection and assessment methods, but also working in corporate HR roles. Mm-hmm. So what I find in the day job now is having to be pragmatic, efficient, productive, but also keep those good ethical best standards, front and centre of everything. My current role at the moment, as you've said, so part of my portfolio involves managing the civil service fast stream. So that's a very prestigious graduate programme, number 2 now in the Times Top 100 listing. And we typically bring in around about 1,000 graduates a year onto 16 different schemes, and they're deployed across government, across 30 plus government departments and arm's length bodies. But I'm also responsible for what we call the government campus. So we deliver a centralised training L&D offer for all civil servants. So right from entry, thinking about all the universal skills and capabilities, up to the most senior leadership roles and indeed ministerial induction.
Wow, fascinating. So, a broad remit, very much centred around skills and clearly thinking about the skills that we're going to need for the future, and so I imagine a big part of your thinking and planning is around the upskilling, and then equally how we identify people with the potential for a landscape that is rapidly changing. And I think, with that in mind, start off your thoughts and perspectives about GenAI and how you think that's going to impact the selection process. And it would be interesting just to hear whether you think that we're just early days on this, or whether you think that there is actually something quite significant about what's happening now, and actually there's a bit of urgency in your mind and perhaps in your team about what the impact might be.
Yeah, thanks, Robert. Well, I think it's fair to say that from my viewpoint is generative AI is here. It's already here. There is an urgency. So I think we need to embrace rather than resist. That's certainly the message that I'm giving to my teams. Actually faster than I've ever seen before in terms of any kind of innovations in the last 20 years. And I do think it is arguably the biggest innovation that we've seen over the last 20 years. If I think about the move that we made, we brought in employment tests when I was first employed. I remember going to invigilate pencil and paper-based testing, and then we saw the move to online tests and so on. But what I do think, the conversation that I have with my teams a lot around selection and assessment and the inclusion of AI, is we need to stay true to our first principles. Right. So thinking about fairness, reliability and validity, because in a sense those are the guardrails, and I think you and I spoke previously around the guardrails that can protect against unintended bias. So we know where we use large language models, we've heard of the horror stories around built-in bias, and I was just reading something last week actually around AI and stereotypes, and I think it was Bloomberg found that imagers associated the most professional jobs with men. So there's lots for us to guard against, and we shouldn't, I think, prioritise efficiency over prediction and diversification, and I can explain a little bit more about that. So I think my role as a leader in this field is to kind of balance up the risk or the potential risks that might face candidates and applicants, but also with the drive to do things quicker, better, shorter. And I think, from a user-centric angle, that's what candidates want to see us doing. And I was thinking about, how to bring this to life for the audience when I talk about reliability, validity, and across my career, some of the selection processes that I've developed and delivered. And an unreliable or an invalid test in many ways is so costly, never mind unethical. And I was thinking about in government, some of the roles, what that may mean. So, for example, if we had an unreliable, invalid test for the selection of RAF pilots, that would mean they could be granted a licence without the knowledge required to fly a plane. A prison officer could be recruited without the skills required to keep the public safe. Or I don't know, a commercial expert could be required without the skills and knowledge needed and end up costing the taxpayer thousands of pounds. So there's lots to think about. But that said, what I'm keen to do is ensure that we establish multidisciplinary teams to develop tests and assessments that are fair and that are valid. And you talked about occupational psychology or business psychology. But in my mind, there's always a red flag if we don't have an occupational psychologist in the room, so to speak, because I think psychologists bring a critical skill set to ensure that models are reliable and, like I said, fair. But I think complementing the data scientists and analysts to develop tests. So going back to your first point of the question is, what am I encouraging my teams to do? Well, it's definitely to encourage and experiment with new technology and with AI. I think a lot about learning agility, creating a safe environment where individuals can kind of get into the learning zone, encourage each other to be curious and to have the courage to innovate. That's really important, I think, and really think about how we can maximise the use of technology enablers through selection and assessment. Because when in the kind of war for talent, if we like to call it that, it's really important that we remain at the leading edge and we're incorporating new methodology as quickly as we possibly can.
Thank you. A lot to unpick there, and some really interesting points. If we start with the efficiency versus effectiveness piece, because that must always be one of the biggest challenges in the public sector. Everybody wants, as taxpayers, best value for money. At the same time, we want RAF pilots that fly planes in the right way, and we want prison officers to be able to do their job effectively too. So where do you, I like your point about guardrails in all of this. So what do you see the challenges are then to getting this balance right between efficiency and at the same time delivering what we need to deliver, which is the right people with the right skills into these, or potential to be trained into these roles? So where do you think GenAI, or where the guardrails need to be? Because clearly it's going to deliver some efficiency, and it'd be interesting to see what you think about that.
That's a really great question. And I think where I'm most worried is where I see the introduction of AI or algorithms or, whatever, whichever kind of approach we're talking about here, quickly brought into selection and assessment without that kind of due consideration of measuring the constructs. So I always keep going back to validity and reliability, but I think that's what's the most concerning, because I think what I certainly see in the public sector and across sectors is this drive for, okay, AI is here, what can we be doing very quickly? And I think there is this ethical responsibility of saying, okay, let's keep pace, let's be creative, let's pilot and test some things, but let's do that with proper evaluation, impact-led evaluation, so that we can really know, are these methods creating any unintended bias against any particular groups? Because it's not generally intended, actually, when there's an inbuilt bias. And also, are we predicting success in the job role? Because, going back again to another first principle, is the reason that we have selection tests through the process is really we want a correlation between performance on the test and performance in the job role. So I think introducing some of those principles of validation and measurement are really important.
Can I just, on that point, because I think it'd be really interesting, given your experience and in the world of government, you probably have a much harsher lens on your results and fairness and how you ensure diversity. So how do you approach then that validity and reliability piece when you're introducing a new piece of technology in this? Do you have a way that you pilot it, or do you have a way that you can test the validity and reliability? Is that through questions? Is it through a pilot? It'd be interesting to hear how you go about that.
Yes, well, generally, many people will, know that designing a test, designing reliable items and valid items takes time. But the problem is here, I think, is we don't have the time that we may have had in the past to spend 1 or 2 years in terms of piloting and refining and validating an instrument. So one thing that we can do is run concurrent studies. So bring something in. We've got a very large, especially with the civil service fastering, we typically have around about 60,000 applicants. Okay. So through the online testing stage, a huge data set that we can test out in a safe way whether some of these new models are working. Because I think what I'm mindful of is over the years, large language models or making sense of unstructured data and incorporating machine learning or algorithms is not particularly new, but we just need to have time for the psychologists, the data scientists to work through and understand the structure and the psychological underpinning. Also then, post-test, apply some of the statistical models that we know, whether that be the simple 4/5 rule of thumb or more sophisticated Cohen's d statistical analysis to see whether there is actually any unfair impact against any particular groups. And that's something that we need to keep measuring. But then also this investment in longer term, longitudinal follow-up, the predictive validation to see whether actually what the test is predicting future job performance, like I said. So that takes a little bit more time. We're sometimes squeezed to kind of do things quickly and then not invest sufficiently in the research or the evaluation that's really necessary.
Yes. So I think that's a couple of really good points that you bring out there. One is you need to do the research around all of this and understand things. But I think it comes back to your earlier point about multidisciplinary teams on this and the importance of having data scientists and psychologists working together on this. I'm sure you're familiar too with that story from Amazon on this and how they ended up doing a sort of CV parsing to try and predict job performance, but using a data set that clearly an occupational psychologist would have had one look at and said, this isn't representative. And so I suppose part of it is when you're doing, I get the point about concurrent studies, do you then put together a team, and is your advice to people, I suppose, who are looking at, taking on new technology and introducing things like algorithms, get an occupational psychologist involved because they've got first principles and training that means that if it's just a data scientist and looking at a correlation, they might miss something?
Yes. I'm sure my fellow psychologists will be really pleased that I'm promoting that. But I actually think, let's not underestimate the importance of having the right expertise, the right specialist and technical expertise. And I think, occupational psychologists won't have that all in terms of developing some of the models. And I think that's why it's a fusion of different skills to get to the optimal product.
Yes. That's right, and I think that's part of, as people are starting to think about the impact of GenAI, that's going to be important. One of the things, just going back to your point about, it takes time to kind of develop these things, validity and reliability. What's your take about, I suppose, the impact of GenAI is going to have this large language model. So it's going to take anything that's language based and have a probabilistic outcome that it can generate very quickly from that. So as you're thinking about how your processes now are working, do you see any risk or threat that large language models will bring into the selection methods that we currently have in place, or you have in place, or many people are using similar kind of processes at the moment?
Yes, most definitely. And I've been really pleased actually to read the research that you've published, Robert, with Arctic Shores, because I think the methods that are going to be most vulnerable to the onset of Chat GPT, Bard, AI, are the more traditional methods around CV, statement of suitability, and also, as we've seen from your research, verbal reasoning, situational judgment test to some extent, and numerical reasoning to some extent, all of which actually we use in the civil service and currently in the fast stream selection process, which is 5 stages. So I'm really thoughtful about those areas. I actually am behind your campaign to scrap the CV. We've done some of our own research in the civil service because actually still most commonly across different levels and job roles, recruiters or hiring managers ask for a CV to support the application. Typically, that's combined with behavioural answers to behaviour-based questions, which again are very susceptible to the large language model onset. So I think moving away from CVs and statements of suitability to a more holistic skill task-based assessment is where we're heading. And our psychology team for the civil service at the moment is developing a new measure of behaviours that is more kind of psychometric based, but will hopefully move us away from that reliance on the CV within the application process, which I think is the most vulnerable. So, like I say, looking for an alternative measure, but that one that still has robust principles in terms of construct validity and reliability.
Okay, thank you. I think I always love the fact that I have more people joining my campaign to scrap the CV, and it's interesting that you see that GenAI actually probably going to accelerate that need anyway, but there is just an argument that the CV has had its time. I think the interesting thing for me about what you were just saying there too is that one of the things that stops people starting that mindset of can we scrap the CV, is there an alternative? And I think what you've just shared with us there, and you've been developing your own sort of behavioural measure, and perhaps it'd be nice just to hear a bit more of how you think people can make that change, and there are things that you're doing internally around this to scrap the CV on this, because it's a lot of people, it's a comfort blanket for them, and really hard, this very idea of, gosh, I've got my bit of paper with a CV on there, how possibly? And public sector is not known as being the one usually to embrace change. So are you using GenAI as a reason then for maybe challenging people as to why the CV, and then developing your own method? It'd just lovely to hear as to how you think you might bring about some of that change in the public sector. Yeah,
I think GenAI is definitely a catalyst, but also, like I say, we've done our own internal research, looking across a huge data set, which we're very fortunate to have. And we found actually that over 40% of candidates responding to a reaction level surveys say they find it hard to apply for jobs in the civil service because of the, if there's a CV requirement or the civil service behaviours. So one thing that we're moving towards, like I say, is the development of a new assessment tool that is a success factor tool based on behaviours, but with psychometric properties, and having a talent and also motive split. If anyone's familiar with the wave assessment, similar in vein to that, but designed specifically for civil service roles. And the questions and the content will only be included if they're predictive of future performance. So that's in the process of being designed at the moment. But the other methods that we incorporate, so for example, in the selection process for the civil service fast stream, our second stage of testing includes more task-based scenarios, so work-based scenarios with lots of video and interactive content, and that really works well and is less vulnerable, I think, to manipulation or the use of Chat GPT, if that's where we want to head in terms of prevention use. But then again, that's a provocation, isn't it, Robert? Like, do we want to encourage candidates and applicants to use and incorporate some of the AI in their own application process? That's something that I'm quite thoughtful about at the moment.
Well, let's just pick up on that one, and I think what you've sort of shared there is absolutely right, which is that we do need to think about the process. There is an alternative to the CV. It needs to be a bit more behavioural based. GenAI actually now indicates that it needs to be a bit more interactive. And then we have this challenge, and we have talked a bit about that, and it'd be nice to explore it a bit more now, of do we encourage candidates to use GenAI in the process? And we talked about we've got to embrace it. The cat's out the bag on this one. Everybody's using it, it's like a calculator. So I don't think many people have worked out all the answers to this one, but where is your thinking at the moment around this? Is it something that you want to put on your career site and say, if you want to use GenAI, great, just tell us, or don't say anything and hope that you can spot it, or there are a number of different challenges around that. So how are you thinking about it at the moment?
Definitely not in the latter. I think, and then that's really interesting. I've read quite a bit recently and had loads of discussions with colleagues and peers around, well, should we be looking to deter use? Should we be looking to introduce kind of remote proctoring into all testing, or should we indeed go back to traditional methods, face-to-face, invigilated pencil and paper tests, which I don't think, definitely not. I wouldn't be recommending we do that. I was actually at a event last week, and we were inducting our new graduates into the civil service, and I took the opportunity to just test out and based on your research, where I think it was 72% of applicants suggest they're now exploring using ChatGPT, and maybe a fifth of those when they're actually applying for jobs. I thought I'd do a little experiment. So I asked a group that I was with to just raise their hands if they had used ChatGPT when applying for the civil service fast stream, and a bit tentative, I think, but eventually most of them did start raising their hands. So it's here, and I think that's what we need to be really thinking about. Okay, then how do we make best use of GenAI in the process, like we would do in the workplace? So from a skills angle, a lot of the focus that I have at the moment is building digital and data literacy and capability. Right. So if that's what we want, and we see the future of work changing with arguably humans doing more value-added jobs, then we want to be thinking about that through the selection process. So I think definitely embracing. I've always been a fan of holistic assessments, so kind of triangulating multiple sources, a bit like the assessment centre method, really, multi-method, multi-data points, multi-source, to get the best measure and prediction of an individual's potential capability, skills, and so on. So I'm really thinking about that holistic methodology, and much more of a move to the task-based approach, like I say, in our second stage currently in the fast stream selection process. However, that said, I think it is going to take a little bit of time to move fully away from the numerical and verbal and situational judgment test. Yes. So, but that's something that we I think we've got to be really thinking about, and it's not a case of sticking our head in the sand and hoping it doesn't come or it doesn't happen, because it is. And that's why I've been really pleased to see your commitment to research and sharing the research, because I think it is true to say, as practitioners in the field, where we want to hold ourselves up to the gold standards, we need the research to be shared. I think there's a bit of a gap at the moment in that area. So I'd be encouraging practitioners, academics, to make and publish free access research, so that we can together kind of move forward and innovate.
Absolutely. No, thank you. And thank you for your encouragement on that one. I'm with you. Part of the reason when Arctic Shores and I was sort of speaking with the team to conduct this research was not so much to go and make a sort of a statement about one form of psychometric assessment versus another. It was GenAI is here. It's moving very rapidly. It could have as much impact on a task-based assessment as it might do on a language-based one. So let's start thinking about how we might research of what its impact would be and put it out into the sort of general discussion points so that people can leverage, because I'm a very strong believer in the benefits of psychometric assessment. And so it doesn't do Arctic Shores any benefit if the world is then running around going GenAI is going to undermine psychometrics. There's as you say, there's been lots of innovation in the past around this. So it's more a case of, right, well, how do we understand it and how do we adapt to it and how do we move on from it and how do we actually take psychometric assessment to the next level, rather than hoping that it'll go away, because it's not, as you say, it's not going to go away from this. So I get your point around this, that there's going to be, we're going to have to think about doing things a bit differently, a bit more interactive, and it's not something that people can put their head in the sand and hope it doesn't come around on this. So you are actively thinking at the moment about how you're going to change your website and your career. If somebody's about to apply for the fast stream thing and they go, oh, can I use GenAI on this? Am I meant to be, am I going to be disadvantaged if I use it? Because they're going to say, oh, you've used AI, we're going to detect that and therefore rule you out. That seems a bit unfair to me. So what's your message, I suppose, going to be? Because you said, there's some long-term change here, but there's some short-term. Have you worked out in your mind what the short-term action needs to be?
Well, that's really interesting. Having just opened our recruitment window for applications, it's perhaps, given my experiment of last week, it's a little bit too early for me to make any immediate changes to the advice. I mean, what I would be saying, I have an 18-year-old son who's just gone to university, so I'm often giving little bits, hints and tips. But I think what we've seen, and through some of your actual research, is there's an assessment centre at the end. So I'd just be a little bit cautious around using ChatGPT too much and then finding yourself unstuck when it comes to maybe the face-to-face assessment or the the interactive assessment, because I think organisations have seen a reduction in the quality in some areas. That's for now, but most certainly what we're focusing on now is the selection process for next year, which I anticipate might be rather different. We've started really, and we've got a sharp focus on the productivity and efficiency agenda in government, but also that's, in terms of HR and selection and assessment. And it's been very exciting that we've been able to incorporate some robots in the back end of the selection process. So that's more in terms of the security, vetting, the check-in. But actually, we're learning a lot from that experience. We're thinking about how we can use GenAI in perhaps things like what we don't have at the moment is a chatbot at the front end. So we're thinking about how we can make the candidate experience much more slicker, engaging, evolving. But then similarly, really thinking about, right, okay, what will our selection process consist of? Will we remove the situational judgment test? Will we have the emphasis on task-based assessments? And we're just working through some of that at the moment, but that's quite exciting. But whilst also looking for the quick wins, and I think some of the quick wins are, bringing our digital friends, we call them our digital friends, in different parts of the process, because from an efficiency angle, I think that has less risk. Because I was quite struck actually by the findings of your research, and I've been very thoughtful from an ethical point of view around, well, what could some of the negative consequences of using ChatGPT be from a candidate angle, and looking at your findings around the free. The paid-for version outperforming the free version. I've been thinking, well, actually, we've since 2015-16 had this real commitment to inclusion, to widening representation, to really thinking about social mobility. we've got a priority commitment to level up the country. So what I'm thinking is, well, okay, are those candidates who can't afford the paid for version going to be at a disadvantage comparatively to those who can? So there are some real considerations, and I think, like anything, we need to just have our eyes wide open around the pros and cons, because there are lots of pros, but we also need to think of how do we mitigate some of those real potential kind of risks and biases that might creep in.
Yes, no, thank you. And I love your sort of what I call your sort of cautious optimism that, we this is exciting, and it's lovely to see, your own personal genuine excitement about what this means, but at the same time being very thoughtful around there are implications around this. And I think for me, one of the most interesting parts of our research was that the paid for version of ChatGPT significantly outperformed the free version. And so the implications of what GenAI is going to mean in the process are more than just how it works. There's different versions of it, and we need to understand, what that will mean. There's still things around bias around this as well that we need to work through. And I suppose I like your point, and this would be interesting in terms of, your advice to other TA leaders thinking about, what do they do and how do they address this, because it's clearly something they have to do now, is how do you experiment with this and get to know it? And so if I understood correctly from what you were just sharing there, that one way to get to know it is to use it as actually bring in a chatbots is clearly one great way to do it and understand. So experiment a bit by bringing it in. I mean, that must be quite hard though in the public sector, because you don't, there's so many consequences of being able to pilot something. But is that how you're going about, getting your team to get more comfortable with this? Is to bring in, I like your term, digital friends, is it? So to bring in some elements that has the least risk, I suppose, of any adverse impact, but you can just gives you, I suppose, a sense of how does AI work. Is that how you're doing it? And when you bring that in, are you doing any kind of vulnerability check as well on this too?
Yeah, I think the vulnerability check is paramount. So we have our teams they are multidisciplinary, so with analysts, the data scientists, the digital folk, the psychologists, all kind of looking at different elements of impact. I think what we are finding, and things often take longer, I think, in government. We have, for good reason, lengthy procurement and commercial processes. So I think sometimes we'd like to move quicker, but a good way of trying to test out some things quite quickly can be by developing internal teams, having a kind of sandbox, if you like, to kind of try out new ways of doing things. Actually, moving away from a selection and assessment piece, but the way that we manage our postings for the graduates is quite complex. Any one time there are over 2,000 graduates on a scheme, and they move each year to a new posting, and we've built in some algorithms to speed up that process. What we've found at the moment is that the algorithm is as good as a human in terms of weighing up all of the preferences, the particular bespoke L&D requirements. So we're still testing that out at the moment, but that's an example of where we can test out something. There's a human kind of QA check in place, but that actually is much quicker. So that's taken kind of 10 working days off our postings process, which is great. And then we can start to explore, okay, so how could we apply that kind of methodology in, perhaps in a test context. But I think the principle that I go back to is, let's not incorporate a methodology into making a hiring decision unless we know that we can, we're confident in terms of the reliability and the validity and the fairness. And it always comes back to fairness as well.
No, thank you. And I think that first principles is absolutely spot on. I really like that sort of example of, how you can get familiar with an algorithm and therefore, AI on this. And one of the things as you were talking about that sort of popped into my mind was this was it seems a sort of mundane process of, okay, I've got 2,000 people, how do I move them around? An algorithm will look at its preferences. Because my big thing about ultimately anything that we introduce artificial intelligence to is transparency. So you've got two things around this. Is there a hypothesis and a model from which, and of course you have existing data on there, you introduce an algorithm, and then you need to have some transparency around this to make sure that, just as an example, that men aren't being pushed into one way and women into another. Yeah. So how did you interrogate that, or was that part, back to that sort of vulnerability, because that was a great example of, this isn't a hiring decision, but it's still actually quite important for somebody's future and outcome. So how did you interrogate whether the algorithm was doing it in the right way, or were you able to, or do you worry whether you're able to?
Well, it's still a work in progress, that particular
Right.
example. And so the teams were carrying out the quality assurance to check if there were any unintended kind of posting outcomes that
Yes.
the algorithm had made. What was the error rate, basically,
Yes.
the teams.
Yes.
And there was still a margin of error. So we haven't actually rolled out the particular, the team are iterating and tweaking the algorithm. And I guess that brings back, that's the other concern, what goes in, if that's poor data, poor coding, poor formula, then that's
Yes.
going to have perhaps a detrimental outcome. So we've got to be really acutely aware and switched on around that. So, and I guess that is one of my fears around people rushing too quickly because they think, this has saved us X amount of hours, X amount of money, that then let's not worry too much about the unintended consequences. So I'm afraid I'm often the voice of doom and gloom around, we need to take care to do things properly before rushing off in one direction. So I think doing that safely with the guardrails, like I've mentioned, is possible. It's still possible to innovate, but doing that carefully and perhaps on like I say, in a sandbox rather than scaling up immediately.
Yes. I think that's great advice, and that particularly when something's moving so quickly and everybody's talking about it, and you've got the likes of Microsoft and others, just suddenly we're going to have co-pilots and digital assistants all over our lives soon, and that feels like there is just a sort of constant push, adopt, and worry about the consequences afterwards. But I think what you rightly point out is there may well be unintended consequences, so put it in a sandbox first. And I suppose that my kind of final kind of question for you around all of this is how do you have any sort of one or two sort of bits of guidance or advice that you'd give somebody that was running a team with selection methods that are based on questions, and how over the next sort of 12 months that they might take some actions and interventions, or read some things, or experiment with some things? What would your advice be to somebody who was leading a graduate team on this, and how they might prepare for what's coming down the line?
So I think first off, keep pace. If anyone stands still for too long, then you're going to get left behind, and that's not going to make for a good candidate experience if you want to attract the top talent. And I think, like I said at the outset, we've seen such advancement over the last 2 to 3 years. I only see that kind of accelerating a bit more.
Yes.
So I think in order to prepare for that and keep pace, your research is a good starting point, because I think that there are some great takeaways there in terms of how recruiters can be really thinking about embracing rather than deterring.
Yes.
Can be thinking about more holistic, task-based methodology as opposed to reliance on some of the traditional methodologies. I think secondly, my advice is always, if you're unsure, ask an expert.
Yes.
Ask a psychologist, ask someone who's got some experience in really developing tests and selection methods. That's a must, because ensuring that tests are reliable and fair is what keeps us out of employment tribunals, quite frankly. So we need to do that.
Yes.
And again, just be really mindful about not forgetting the basics. So as ever with any, incorporating any test or assessment, looking for any unintended consequences, any particular bias. Are there any differentials between particular groups, protected or unprotected? I think that's my advice. But be creative and innovate, because this is really exciting. It's going to change how we recruit, and we've got to keep up. The world of work is changing, and we should be excited rather than fearful about this, I think.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Sonia. 3 great bits of advice, and I love your final perspective about this, that we need to accept that it's here and be creative about it rather than fearful of it, while at the same time understanding what the consequences might be and being mindful of those. And it's been fascinating hearing your advice, and I know a lot of people would take away a lot of great things from what you've shared. So thank you so much for coming along the podcast, and best of luck in continuing to run and develop the Fast Stream civil service program, which is one of the ones that I know a lot of people aspire to, in terms of being a great example of a really good program. So thank you.
Thanks.